Welcome to the Parent Advocate Podcast, a show where we celebrate, defend, support, and uplift the voices of the LGBTQIA community. I'm your host, Stephen Chikumba. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm joined by my amazing co-host, Lisette Trujillo.
Hi everyone, Lisa here, she, her, ea. The mission of the Parent Advocate podcast is to elevate conversations and reframe narratives around trans and non-binary youth to help change hearts and minds. Each week we bring you our take on all things happening from the perspective of two parents of BIPOC transgender kids.
Lisette, we have got to talk about Pride, SCOTUS, and the recent decision around trans sports, and a new survey that unfortunately paints a bleak picture for trans kids in schools. We've also got a guest on our show today, Derek Bloom, to talk about fighting for liberation.
Stephen, there's literally so much for us to get into.
Well, what are we waiting for? Welcome, everyone, once again to the Parent Advocate Podcast. Let's get started. Lisette, once again, it's been like a month since we've spoken. This is some straight up bullshit. Catch me up.
So you've been on your dad's movie promotional tour, which is very exciting. They actually had a showing last weekend or this past weekend here in Spain. So that's to you. Things are good. We obviously participated in Pride. We walked. I don't know if you've ever met Ashton Mota, Carmen's son, but he was here for a few weeks studying, and so we got to spend time with Ashton, who is an advocate, a trans youth advocate for Gendercool, and finishing up college. That was really nice to see Ashton. We spent Pride Month connecting with the community here. It was really interesting to hear them talk about things they were unhappy about with their government, but yet, if they're on, the public healthcare system, they're getting their healthcare needs met. It was very interesting to hear their views on the US and where we are, and being really worried about it traveling to Europe, which I told them they should. You have time to ensure that this kind of fascism doesn't trickle your way, or anti-trans, that as Amara coined it, the anti-trans hate machine doesn't jump across the ocean in a more significant way, because they are making inroads and trying. And then Daniel graduated from high school last Tuesday. He gave the commencement speech. My family's been here, which has been nice, and my dad, and we've gotten a chance to see where Daniel's going to go to school and where he's going to live. And I think the one thing everyone keeps saying is how grateful they are to see Daniel so happy and free, feeling very carefree and able to really focus on the things that he loves, as opposed to all the things we were experiencing back home. And I think that makes us feel a little bit guilty, because there's things that have passed back home, and we know ballot referrals that are going to move into the November ballot that will impact families we love. So it's just been a lot. How about you? Tell me about all things, the dad, Stephen, all the fun things.
Well, first, congratulations to Daniel, both on graduating and the commencement speech. That's a big deal, especially since he just got there, already a mover and a shaker. So kudos to Daniel and his parents. So for me, it was all things Pride. We actually marched with the new governor, Mikey Sherrill. Nicole and I literally were holding the banner at the top of the governor's entourage, which was really cool. And she had all the social media, she had the van, she had the DJ playing music. It was super cool, and it was really nice to see the crowds that came out to support Pride, because definitely Pride has been assailed from all sides, but to see folks still showing up in joyful defiance was really positive. Last month I was also at the Congressional Dads Caucus, which was amazing. With Equimundo, Lucina and I received the Dad Award for our advocacy and the work that we were doing to elevate stories of gender expansive people and their families. So that was really nice. I was also awarded Ally of the Year, Lisette, from the Mercer County Office of LGBTQ plus Affairs, and our county, I can't remember Dan Benson's official title, but he's a big deal in Mercer County. And I received the award for, again, just being out here in these streets. And then this is net new. I told you that I'm part of this dad's group out of Asbury Park. The organization is called Transpirational, and it's really a group for families. But out of that group, they started a dad's group, and I've been going for, I want to say, a little over a year. But No, a little over 2 years. They were so inspired by the retreat, the dad's retreat. And so they held their own dad's retreat last weekend in Poconos and they had 12 dads show up. It was so nice. So I told them that they were the inaugural chapter of the New Jersey dads and they're all founding members. Now there's no official charter, but it really was so nice. They had mini sessions where they talked about their relationship with faith because obviously faith is a big thing for many people and the reason that many people default to for why they can't accept their children. There was another session on feminism, and feminism, for folks who don't know, is about resistance to oppression. If you do your history, you will know that through those three phases of feminism that feminist scholars talk about, the unifying factor is resistance to oppression. And then we talked about what advocacy looks like, showing up in everyday life in all ways, big and small. It was really nice. Oh, and they tried to keep me from going to retreats because there was a snake out there and they were talking about bears. And I told them I don't really like to camp, I like to glamp. And so I think I'm going to make sure all future retreats have no wildlife near them. That's my
Stephen.
hope.
It's so funny because when we bump into people who are from Spain, they're very into cowboys. And so they're like, Lizette, are you from the place of the scorpions and the rattlesnake? And I'm like, we are from the place because we bump into animals all the time. How do
Yeah,
you?
I don't want to. I don't want to. There was a frog there. The frog was like as small as a cookie. So I was very okay with the frog. I wasn't okay with the snake because the snake was like literally in the front of the house. They were like, "Oh, we're gonna have snake for dinner." I was like, "What the fuck are y'all talking about?" And they're like, "Oh, come, we're gonna catch it." And I was like, "These motherfuckers are serious." And lo and behold, in the front of the house on the little like welcome mat was a snake. Now,
No.
it was a 2 foot garter snake or garden snake. It was not a actual boa constrictor or python or anything that could have injured me, but that's like a thing of nightmares. Snakes are the thing of nightmares.
I hear.
So, but
Okay.
said we could talk wilderness and snakes and cookie and scorpions and cowboys all day, but we've got to get to today's topics.
All right. Let's do it.
All right, Lisa, talking about pride, this year honestly seemed more consequential than ever, not only because all those jokers who pop their heads up during pride and are nowhere to be found year round obviously made the rounds trying to show up for pride in their rainbow colors, but folks weren't having it. And I'm talking specifically about all the former grand marshals of NYC Pride who basically wrote a letter demanding that NYC Pride shut out all the hospitals who abandoned trans kids this year. And what I love about this movement was that once again, GLM was at the head of it, leading the effort to make sure that we hold people accountable when they fail our community.
Stephen, I was really proud to see Eliel and Raquel really lead and spearhead that, and to see so many protesters show up in front of the different hospitals. I think it's been a really difficult time for families to constantly be up in arms about whether their children will have a continuation of care, right? Because we're not even talking about people who are awaiting care. We're talking about people who have been receiving health care that's necessary for them. And to have that stripped away feels terrifying, especially because it's not healthy, right? It's not healthy for that to happen. And so I was really, really proud of them and wish I could have been there.
It reminded me of one of our episodes months ago where you talked about Tucson Pride. Maybe it wasn't called Tucson Pride, but the Pride organization in Arizona that basically was like the lead organization having to like shutter its doors because it couldn't afford to put on Pride anymore. And you said, and I believe it was, they had a problematic history because they allowed people who do not support the trans community to participate in Pride. And it's a harmful thing. They have police barricading or standing outside the point that you get into this very like cordoned off area, and it's the antithesis. Like if you've got to have police telling you you can and cannot go in places, that literally is the antithesis of pride. It was a protest against police violence and the way they were treating LGBTQ plus people. And so to have to go through a cordoned off area through police for
Mhm.
pride, that's like, y'all don't really understand what we're doing here, do you?
And it's wonderful to see that NYC's Pride really centered, because what you're touching on is the fact that oftentimes to raise money to put on a Pride event, you bring in corporations, and sometimes those corporations are so problematic. And so seeing them center community instead of the corporations and institutions that cause harm was really lovely.
Absolutely.
All right, Stephen, can we talk about SCOTUS once again ruling against transgender girls being able to play in sports and essentially co signing the ability of states banning them altogether? Transgender students faced a major setback Tuesday when the Supreme Court upheld the state's ban on trans girls and women participating in female school athletic programs. While the decision was a significant victory for the Republican-led states that enacted the policies, it severely limited the ability of trans youth to fully participate in school activities as themselves.
I can't. I honestly can't with the Supreme Court. I was talking about this last night on Mark Lamar Hill's show about what the decision says and didn't say. And it said that, in not so many words, states can, but are not required to discriminate, which means, and if there's a silver lining, it's this, that states that do not have sports bans are not required to prohibit trans students from and trans athletes from participating in sports. And again, that's like a nuanced read, but the reality is we got to take whatever little bits of joy and silver linings we can find, because this particular Supreme Court is hell-bent on depriving as many rights as they possibly can.
I mean, Thomas tried to get into it, and luckily it was too narrow for that to really take precedence. So I too was grateful.
I mean, he wrote the dissent. Like, that's the thing. He wrote his dissent. No one joined him, but he still wrote it. And it's so disappointing that the most senior black jurist on the Supreme Court is one of the most hateful jurists on the Supreme Court, who is single-handedly responsible for co-signing so much of the harm that is befalling Americans since he became a member of the Supreme Court. Like, every horrible decision the Supreme Court has ever issued, he has been lockstep with them.
Absolutely. I could say a lot of hateful things, but
I
maybe we
mean, we're
want
not
to the
saying
next
hateful things
topic.
if we're talking about facts. If he's a douche rocket, he's a douche rocket. If he is in the pocket of the Harlan Crows of the world, you know what I'm saying? Like, he's in the
Yeah.
pocket. If he's
Yeah.
bought and sold and paid for, he's bought and sold and paid for. Like, these are things that are true.
Yeah. And also, too, to hear, to have the news break after the SCOTUS ruling came out that Roberts, too, is being indicted for receiving $20 million dollars in gifts, right? Like, it makes you think about the real life harm they've caused through the different rulings they put out this last year and the fall and this year. And you think, how is it that we can have faith in institutions when the people who belong to them are just so corrupt?
Just so corrupt. It goes back to Citizens United.
Hmm.
Once you start creating these carve outs for corporations to allow them to do things that historically the separation of powers was established to prevent. We didn't leave a monarchy where a person said that they were appointed by God for life to come to another place and establish a democracy, air quotes, and have somebody else consider himself a god, erect golden statues to himself, and all other branches of government to genuflect and bow down and offer zero resistance to the monarch-like things that this person is trying to do. I don't understand how we're here. And more importantly, I don't understand how more people are not literally outraged at what is happening in front of them. All the people who were talking about one nation under God did not mean that we're a Christian nation. That's
Right.
not what it means. There was
Right.
like specific separation of church and state. And if you go back to the letters of Thomas Jefferson way back when, if you go back to what they said way back when, they were like, yeah, no, we are not going to allow this government to be governed by people who defer to religion or to a religion in governance of everybody else, because everybody else doesn't believe in the same things that this little cabal believes. Oh my goodness.
Stephen, I also think for our listeners, they need to really go and listen to Amara Jones' Anti-Trans Hate Machine podcast. There was a really powerful episode where she interviewed one of the women who was part of the gay conversion movement, right? Like, she was a gay woman who was used by the far right for many years and said that she had changed and was no longer gay and was part of like this like gay conversion movement of the 90s. And she said that she was coached to say that it was a lifestyle, it was a choice, it was all these things. And so you hear that a lot from family members who are like, well, you can choose that lifestyle, but I don't believe in it, right? And they don't realize that that's a manufactured phrase and that it's a very strategic manufactured phrase to say that our trans loved ones and our LGBTQ loved ones aren't protected under the 14th Amendment because it's a mutable characteristic. And you and I know that our children are who they are, that it is immutable, unchangeable. And so it's interesting to hear how language that we've heard a majority of our lives has been continuously manufactured by the far right and by lobbies who've had an agenda, and it's part of our culture, and we think we're just having like these innocuous conversations around identity and sexuality when really oftentimes we're just peddling marketed rhetoric to each other. I found that to be a really powerful episode when I heard it, and I think everyone needs to hear it. And then to read Thomas's words, I was like, I'm not fooled. I am not fooled by you. And I know what you're
So
doing.
I thought you were actually going to talk about Amara's podcast from the SCOTUS decision, where she was talking with Chris Geidner from Law Dork, and they
Yes.
were unpacking the actual decision and what it said. And I love that you're calling out something that I've been talking to. Like, we had an emergency meeting of the dads yesterday, and we were talking about this decision and what it meant and what it didn't mean. And I actually said, you need to go back and start reading about the history of the attacks on transports. Like, the very first law that was passed was in like 2020, I want to say in Idaho. And it was the very first one. 2 years later, there were 15 or 16 more. And it has been this steady progression. And it's come out of Alliance Defending Freedom. It's come out of the Heritage Foundation. It's come out of all of these right wing think tanks who basically did focus groups, and they said this is something that we can run with because it's an accessible point. Everybody wants to talk about, air quotes, fairness in sports, and this is a way for us to create a wedge issue and pit people against one another, and more importantly, drive people to the polls. Like,
Yeah.
that's all it was. It's an election strategy. And if you recognize that the point of this thing is like, oh, we no longer have marriage equality to fight for, what else can we do to really get people at each other's throat, where we can throw red meat at the base and we can get people out for elections? What can we do? And
Yeah.
we saw in the last election how much money was spent to get people to fear trans people. Kamala is for they, them. Donald Trump is for you. Like, what the hell?
Yeah.
What the hell?
People don't realize the very first bathroom bill that they tried to test was in 2013 in Arizona, and it got squashed. And then we see North Carolina, right? And the pushback. And I think what I always try to remind parents is trans people have never had their full rights and protections. What really was happening is that trans youth started winning in the courts. And trans youth started having their families show up to testify. Not many, but loud enough to make an impact. And so we started seeing Gavin Grimm's case move. We saw Wayne Main's case move through, and we were seeing these precedents in the court be set. And so you're right that, the Idaho law passed in around 2018, 2019, which is when they started to try to flood states. So I remember 2018 being like, we saw 3 or 4 bills in Arizona. 2020 was like the reprieve. You know what I mean? But 2021 came, and all of a sudden we went from 4 bills to 120 bills to 600 to 1,000, right? And so people weren't paying attention, and now it's overwhelming.
Yeah. And I mean, it's so overwhelming that a recent survey found that 2 out of 3 school students in the US feel unsafe due to their LGBTQ plus identity. According to a recent report from GLSEN, 2/3 of LGBTQ plus students in the US felt unsafe in school due to their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or their gender expression. These results came out of the 13th National School Climate Survey, which evaluated the 24-25 school year, gathering insights from kids from K through 12, including intersex, asexual, and two-spirit youth. And obviously, the findings are devastating. They really are. I'm even getting choked up now. There are no words to express how I feel thinking about that.
GLSEN has been doing incredible work. And I think, and I hope I'm saying their name, they went back to their original name, GLSENT, this last year. And I'm just so grateful for their, the research polls they continue to put out, their commitment to students. And I think having organizations like GLSENT in states that are being targeted makes the world of difference for students who feel unheard, unseen, and they find their people, right, through Glissant and other LGBTQ school organizations. And so while this is devastating, we know it's not new. And I just am grateful for the organizations that continue to show up, and even when finding funding to do this work feels hard.
Yeah, I just want our listeners to think about that. Think about, how can you step in and provide that support? How can you make sure that the schools your children attend are safe? And if you're an ally listening, what can you do to make sure that students who identify as LGBTQ plus, are queer, are neurodivergent, are differently abled, feel safe in school, notwithstanding?
Absolutely.
Derek Bloom is a lifelong community organizer and radical educator who currently serves as the Food and Social Justice Director at Trinity Church in Asbury Park, New Jersey. Over the past 20 years, Derek has worked across the country at the intersection of housing justice, anti-colonialism, and youth advocacy, from supporting indigenous resistance in Arizona to founding grassroots coalitions in New Mexico. Today, he lives on Lenni Lenape territory in Asbury Park, where he builds intersectional community programs to combat systemic oppression, address immediate hunger and housing needs, and advocate for police oversight and affordable housing. In his downtime, he enjoys surfing, reading, and walking in wild places. Everyone, please welcome Derek Bloom to our show.
Welcome, Derek, to the show. We're so happy you could join us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So, I have the first question, and it is Derek, in your bio, you explicitly share your identity markers, which are white settler, cisgender, anti racist, queer male, and you firmly ground your location in Lenni Lenape territory, both where you grew up and where you live in Asbury Park. For parents listening who are trying to teach their kids about identity, accountability, and history, this intentionality is powerful. How does deeply understanding and naming your own identity, relationships to the land, shape the way you approach community organizing? And why is the grounding so critical for the next generation?
Wow, that was a great question. I think people say that was a great question, but like, whoo, that was a good question. Yeah, I think it's so important. And first of all, the reason I do that is because I worked with Dene or Navajo elders out in Black Mesa, Arizona, who are still currently resisting a forced relocation from the U.S. government and Peabody Coal. And from the 70s till today, the U.S. government has forcibly relocated over 16,000 Dene or Navajo people, making it the biggest forced relocation since the Trail of Tears. And I lived there for 10 years working with them and supporting their resistance. And that's how they introduced themselves. And that's how they taught me to introduce ourselves. So I'm borrowing from their knowledge. But the reason it's important, because your history, who you are, tells more of who you are, where you came from, what your histories were, what trauma might have been, what trauma might not have been, is like the cis white part, right? The identity markers are so important because that tells people who we are. Then, since when we get into conversation, we know where we're going from there. Specifically in Dene culture, they talk about their clans from it's a 5-minute introductory sentence almost, and you know where they come from for thousands of years. And it's to bring history or her story to the present moment, to bring all the relations, all the people to this present moment, because we're also our past, we're also our relations, and so it brings it all into who we are now. So it also begs a collective existence, even though we are an individual. And then as far as the gender marker that I say cis is because even though I'm a queer person, it also kind of situates, I do have privilege as someone identifying with the gender of their birth. And, I think specifically for white folks who identify as settlers as well, it's important to identify and recognize the power that we hold in the society, unfortunately, whether we want to or not. And specifically, I say settler in an introduction is I don't want to normalize settler colonialism. One of the projects of settler colonialism is to destroy to replace. And when I don't do that, when I say that actually that the United States is a settler colonial nation and the territory has never been ceded, not one treaty has ever been honored. When I say settler, I recognize the historic of violence and the current violence that still exists, realizing that we're still in a settler colonial society. So it's just very important to do. I don't always do that orally when I meet people, but Dene folks do it orally. You know, a meeting almost takes like an hour and you just know who each other are at that point. And
I really appreciate the depth and breadth of that answer. I love the way you connect the dots for folks. And I think that reading your background and hearing about the things that you've done, your background is really incredibly vast. You have worked with the Dene people resisting forced relocation in Arizona to anti-war movements and radical history teaching. It feels like your life's work is literally a masterclass in solidarity. So for families watching the news right now and feeling frankly overwhelmed by global and local injustices, how do you define joint solidarity or joint struggle in a way that everyday people can practice at home or in their neighborhoods?
well, first of all, when I think of joint solidarity or joint struggle, that's an interesting term that I'm not sure a ton of folks know. You know, I think the word back in the day was more allyship, but more militant indigenous folks like Khalid Benali, I think is the Dene activist who kind of coined that joint struggle and kind of critiqued the ally industrial complex. But I think, you know, one thing is you can never identify as a person who's in joint struggle necessarily or as an ally. The person or the oppressed group that you're working with has to identify you as that. But in the meantime, as someone with, you know, cis, white, settler privilege, you just got to do the work, you know, and I think, and I know it's corny and I know everyone says it, but it's all about relationship. You know, when I went out to meet the Dene resistors, you know, I only planned to be there for 2 or 3 months. But because of that deep relationship, when I knew the feds were going to be coming for the elder sheep, because that's how they kind of kick them out, they take away their sustenance and things like that. These people that I knew and had relationships with, including the land, it made it harder for me to not stay. And then I dedicated about 8 or 9 years of my life staying there because of those relationships. So in these hard times, I would say the first thing is easy. Go out and make relationships. And then, you know, whether you're making relationships with folks experiencing homelessness or trans folks or Palestinians or undocumented folks, it's through the relationship that you're going to want to start to act more. We went on a dad's retreat for dads of trans kiddos and gender nonconforming kiddos. And, you know, one of the questions I asked, and it, you know, kind of made me sound a little bit pious, but I was like, well, where were all the dads for trans folks before their kids were trans, before they knew their kids were trans? And, you know, I don't want to focus on that part, but I think the answer was when they had a relationship to someone in the trans community, like that's when they stepped up. So the first part is through relationship. When you know a trans person, when you love a trans person, like you're going to fight for them, or at least I hope you would, and vice versa to, you know, other oppressed groups in this country. So I think it starts with relationship and just showing up. I think you don't need to have all the language I do. Certainly try. People certainly appreciate when, you know, you have the language of the community you're trying to enter. So like do a little bit of homework, maybe talk to a friend that might be in there, but don't be so scared that you're not showing up. Show up, build relationships. And I find that once the relationships are there, it's hard to resist being in solidarity with them. And the last thing I'll say, President Obama and forgetting the last president. What was his name? Joe Biden. Joe Biden. I wasn't a huge fan. I did vote for him. But anyway, deported more people than any president in US history. Obama did. And then Trump actually did not beat Obama, and then Joe Biden did beat Obama, and then now during the Trump administration, certainly it has escalated to being more physically and violent. But I like to say that it has always been physical and violent, and it's always been about separating families. But here we have, because of the videos, because of the more violent way it's done, people are starting to have a relationship with it in their community. And people that, quite frankly, I don't know why we haven't been on the front lines of defending our undocumented siblings. And I think the reason, whether not a judgment, but the reason is because people are starting to have a relationship with it. Similar to like Vietnam. You know, people didn't really care about the war, but once they saw what was happening in those villages, once they saw those pictures, there was that relational moment, and it was hard, you know, to say no.
And Derek, to tie it all together to anti-Blackness, right? The conditions that immigrants today find themselves in are occurring because of law that was put into place to keep Haitian people out. And so there's a very famous lawsuit. I don't remember the name. I was talking to an immigration lawyer about this. He was sharing with our cohort about how there was a famous case that went up through the courts that was like, what you are doing to Haitian undocumented people is discriminatory. And so they said, well, then we'll just do it to everyone. And so that's when we see like the modern industrial complex of like detainee and immigration processes that are even more violent and cause a lot of harm. It's modern, right, in the ways in which we look at immigration. And so all of our struggles are connected in these very intricate ways, and it's hard for people to piece it all together. Because what you're talking about is proximity changes hearts, right? Like these dads came into a space because they had proximity to someone that they love deeply. And so you're right, like where were you before? That's a valid question when we're talking about movement. Oftentimes, parents have a really hard time even wanting to participate in movement because it's the first time they've ever been marginalized, so they can't conceptualize that level of discomfort. I'm wondering, what was your entry point? Right, because you had to have had an entry point to work with the Dene folks who Daniel and I went up to Flagstaff and presented with the Navajo tribe up there a few years back. And it was an incredible experience to be with medical care providers, tribal leaders who were trying to bring more resources to their area. What was your entry point? What, I guess, radicalized you? For me, it was my 7th grade, 8th grade teacher, Miss Nancy Makoviak, who was like an ex-nun, a radical, like in the struggle, woman. And she like every day was about what we needed to do in the world.
Was she a Jesuit?
I don't know if she was a Jesuit nun. What I do know
Okay.
is that I love her story. She left the nunhood. She was a nun who was part of, why can't I think anymore? The Farm Workers Union. She was helping organize farm workers in California, and she fell in love with a Jewish advocate. And so she left the nunhood and got married. So she was like an ex-Catholic nun who then converted to Judaism. But she was like so incredible. Like she had 2 saint paintings, one of Father Raul, who was a martyr in El Salvador, and Malcolm X. And she would put her hands on both of them and pray to them every day. And she was just this incredible, chain-smoking, radical woman who really shaped my understanding of what I needed. Like she would tell us things like never allow people to misspeak your name, just simple things around empowerment and care. So sorry, I know that's a long-winded question, but what radicalized you?
So yes, there was a process, and feel free to stop me if this is too long of a story. So I was 10 or 11, and I realized that I wanted to have sexual relationship with my best friend, who was also 10 and 11 at that age. And I was so internally homophobic. I started, having sex with my best friend at 11, and that made me question a lot of things because I thought it was wrong to be gay. I don't even think I knew what trans meant at this point. I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is a pretty wealthy, white, conservative area. But that really started me on my path, and I was pretty much closeted till I was 22. I told a few different friends, and I had a lot of story. And then also while I was in school, I was put in learning disability classes. I couldn't read till I was in 4th grade. So I never really went into the advanced history classes. So I figured I didn't really learn so much about our white supremacist history and upbringing that the United States has had quite as much. I didn't have that narrative of American exceptionalism because they didn't think I could like handle it, I think my spelling test words were like the same till I was in 9th or 10th grade. They didn't really think we would be able to learn, so they didn't really teach us much. So I think that actually kind of helped not colonize me through the public school system, which, unfortunately is a tool to colonize, to make workers, and specifically if you're indigenous, to take your culture and replace it with Christian white culture. So I had a little break from that. I did go to my 20-year high school reunion, and there weren't very many radicals there. But fast forwarding a little bit, I grew up listening to like punk, hardcore, and hip hop. who had very leftist messages. I don't think I always knew totally what they were talking about, but like definitely made me always like question. And then when I was 18, a friend and I decided to quit my carpentry job and I went to go drive around the country for a year and volunteer in soup kitchens in every major city in Canada and the US. And I started talking to people, and specifically our car blew up. And so I started hitchhiking and we started living on the streets with folks. First thing that hit me is that something, the statistic, it's either a third to a quarter, and I think this is still true, of people experiencing homelessness are vets. And I was like, wait a minute, like you fought for this country, but like you don't have adequate mental health care or housing. And it really just stuck with me. And again, it was through relationship because I was like sleeping on the streets with these people and like you don't really have a lot to do out there but like talk. And I was sober at that point in my life as well. So that really started it. And then on the LGBTQIA front, I went to a Bible study at Glide Church in San Francisco, which is one of the more progressive churches in the country, probably. And they had a soup kitchen in their basement, and a lot of formerly incarcerated people were working there. And so I got to know them, and then hear about the horrors of the prison system. And then I went to this Bible study, and it was led by a trans Black woman. And coming from where I came from, I didn't really know what to do with that. And even though I was seriously internally homophobic because I myself was a queer person, but wouldn't even really reflect on it, I went to this Bible study. And at the very end of it, she pulled me aside and, talked to me. And she's like, Derek, you had a lot of questions about gender and sexuality. I wanted to tell you something that might help you. And this kind of changed my life forever. And also understanding this now, it wasn't a Black trans woman job to like educate a white cis dude, but she did. It was really based out of love, and I'll thank her forever for that. I don't even know her name. And she said to me, you've heard it is said that you can love the sinner but hate the sin, and I'm saying that you can't, because we don't want your love. If we don't want your love, you can't love us. We don't want your love if you don't love who we love, if you don't love how we love. So, Derek, you have a big decision to make. You can choose to love our community, or you cannot. And, I grew up in right-wing Christianity, praying to God, and took the Bible very serious to the point where I wanted to be like Jesus. And I was sort of on a pilgrimage for a year living on the street. I remember going to Ocean Beach in San Francisco, and I was tormented. I was on the beach like, God, what do I do? Like, I don't want to not love people. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And unfortunately, God has never like audibly spoken to me, I think, but I feel like I hear from God, from the collective, from past experiences, people you meet, feeling in your gut to deep morals of what is right and wrong. And I was on the beach and I was just tormented. I wanted to do the right thing. And I know people don't like to hear this out loud, but some homophobic Christians are actually homophobic because they believe it's loving. So it's a real dark thing that we got to work towards, because they're not even trying to be hateful. They think that if you become straight, you will feel the best, you will feel loved. And that if you only knew that you could. So that is like a hard part. And that's where I was coming from in some ways. It's a little problematic, but kind of true. And I was on the beach in Ocean Beach in San Francisco, and I just said, fuck it. Like, I want to love. Like, if I've interpreted anything from the Bible, Jesus says that of all the Levitical laws, which I think there were like 613 or 513 at the time, it's like, yeah, easy. Love your neighbor as yourself, which means love yourself and love your neighbor. And I just said, fuck it. I'm going to love. And in that moment, the first person I loved was myself. The next day, I like told my friend my past, who was best friends with the person I was with on and off junior high, high school, elementary school, kind of blew his mind. And then I started kind of coming out to people and loving myself. And then, longer story short, I got back to the East Coast and started living in New York City and found out that there was a Christianity and Anarchy conference. And I was like, what? You could be like an anarchist and Christian? And I got involved, and I do remember her name, Nikisha, who is actually a African American woman. And that kind of kept me into my faith, and that kind of started my path when I was 18 or 19.
Stephen, I know this is you, but really quick. So I went to Catholic school, and the priests at my Catholic school were Jesuit priests. So many of them shared their stories of watching Martin Luther King speak on the Washington Monument. What you're saying is like really, maybe I was meant to hear it because I'm in the same space. But my sister came out to visit this last week, and my dad's been with us, and we were talking about life, where we are. And I was telling her that the place I try to be in as a 46-year-old today, because don't get me wrong, like, I'm human, I can be petty, I can be bitchy, I can be all the things. But not too long ago, my husband had a dream of his mom, and she was a very spiritual, religious woman. And when he was little, she used to call him her pedacito de Dios, a little piece of God, right? And so she came to him in his dream, and he asked her, am I still your little piece of God? And she said, no, you're God in a tiny, tiny piece. And I think a lot of times we forget, spiritual teachings teaches us that we are all God, right? A God incarnate in form. This gets into something deeper that maybe our listeners are like, where is Lisette going? But I think about this in these moments where you feel hopeless, or you feel this world is really disappointing in so many ways. And I think what you're talking about is something powerful, right? And how we need to engage and see people as godly, right? See our loved ones as godly, and see them, and not in the biblical sense, but in the spiritual sense of that we are all these, like, we're beyond form, right? And come to learn, and come to learn from one another. And so I just want to say thank you for sharing that, because you started your answer with, if I take too long, let me know. But I appreciate where you've taken this conversation, and thank you so much.
He's
Thank
learning
you.
from the Danae people. Like, you don't just give a, hey, I'm Derek. He's like, hey, I'm Derek, and let me tell you about me so that we can learn and know each other deeply. Derek and I met because one of the dads in Transpirational invited me to Trinity Church, where we have our meetings. And I met Derek and a bunch of other fathers of gender expansive children. And I was truly impressed. And I told him this. We were at this retreat last weekend. He was talking about the dads of the retreat. This was the New Jersey dads meeting together for the first time at a retreat, inspired by, of course, the dads. And I was sitting around with all these white people and a Hispanic person, or a Latino person rather. And I told him, I was just like, I don't really fuck with white people that tough. Like, but I fucks with y'all because you all are doing the work. You are doing the work to be self-aware enough to recognize your solidarity with marginalized people. You're not better than, you are equal to the other people in this struggle. And you're doing your damnedest to unlearn the crap you've been sold about who you are and how you show up in the world, or how you should show up in the world. And so I really appreciate people who recognize their privilege and are unlearning white supremacy, patriarchy, sexism, all the things, because that's what it's going to take for us to get to any form of equity for people. So that's just a little aside. But as parents and advocates, we often focus on how to protect our youth from everything, the school to prison pipeline, from marginalization and systemic harms. You've been on the ground doing that counter military recruiting and working directly with impacted youth. I want to know from your perspective, what are the biggest conceptions adults have about at-risk youth, and how can parents better advocate for like restorative justice practices in their own schools, local communities, etc.?
So I think I'll talk through this. So in Flagstaff, I was also a high school counselor for kids that were kicked out of the public school system or coming out of juvie. So working with kiddos, youth in high school that, yeah, the system sort of deemed worthy to go to jail, which I would teach in the jails. I think it's horrifying how carceral our system is. And even to the point, I started the Asbury Park Transformative Justice Project with the founder of Black Lives Matter here in Asbury Park. And people can call us as an alternative to the police. And we have a community accountability processes to replace the criminal justice system. And even like left-wing queer folks still want punishment, still want incarceral stuff. We come up from a culture of deep punishment, which actually comes from indigenous genocide and enslavement here. You get punished if you challenge power. And so I think it's always important to challenge power. And, honestly, as a parent, I probably fucked up a little bit. I think I got power confused with giving my kiddo healthy boundaries. And I'm trying to like figure that out and like make up for that. So I don't know if I'm the best model, but to the youth, and I think I told you this story, Stephen, but specifically regarding to LGBTQI community, some of the youth would use slurs like the F word and not fuck. And instead of getting them in trouble, calling their parents, telling the principal, I was like, come in my office. And first, I would say, well, what would you say if I told you I was queer? And they're like, woo, they got real quiet, because I had a deep relationship with folks. I mean, it was cool. That school was awesome. I bring in former Black Panthers who started the Seattle Black Panther chapter. We brought in Dene elders to connect Dene youth to their history. So, I had a relationship with them. So when I said this, they're like, oh, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. And then I had asked them, and I try not to force it, but I was like, if you could, I would like you to read a little bit on Stonewall. Just like if you want to be homophobic, I can't not make you do it. Maybe just in this building I can. But like, I don't want to just make you not say it in this building. I want you to understand at least who you're being homophobic to. And so I would make them, or like make them slash they kind of agreed to do it because they knew they could possibly get in more trouble. It was a little problematic, I'll be real with you. But they would do it and they had no clue. They had no clue. I showed them pictures of like, cop cars burning and flipped over and like the deep resistance of the Stonewall movement. And there was things that predated that as well. So sometimes it just takes deeper relationship with youth and really getting to know them, and really hear their story of why they're doing things that are harmful to themselves and others. And it doesn't always change because, trauma is really hard to work through. So if your kiddo has trauma, definitely if you can afford therapy, highly recommend that. But honest, open relationships with your kiddos. I highly believe in freedom. I don't think lying is really this moral dualistic thing like good or bad. But every time we lie, we take away our own freedom to be who we are. And so I think we need to be honest with our kids and we need to create space so our kids can be honest with us. Hope my mom actually never sees this interview, but because they were so conservative, I didn't tell them anything. I didn't tell them anything. When I told my mom that I was, sleeping with my best friend growing up years later, I mean, it blew her mind. I got into substance abuse, you name it, other than like methamphetamines, actually. I didn't have the freedom to tell them what I was doing and what I was experiencing. I was scared. And it's corny, but kiddos need relationship. They need real relationship. In my experience, the more people you have real relationship with, the better shot you have to be healthy. And I don't believe that punishment brings relationship.
So, Derek, I don't know if Stephen told you, but I'm from Arizona. And I think for our listeners who are listening, I think the work you were doing with those youth is really important. The ACLU of Arizona has been trying for a long time. And honestly, I don't remember if they ever got this lawsuit off the ground, but there is a law in the state of Arizona that once a student is expelled, any school they try to enter can reject them. So if anyone's expelled at any age along the way, the state of Arizona doesn't have to require them or give them an education. And so this really impacts communities of color, young children who are just tossed aside for having behavioral issues early on. And so thank you for doing that work because it's really important. And I just wanted to give a little insight into Arizona and its problematic legal landscape.
And also, just one addition to that reminded me, since we're talking about cultural identity, whether it be gender or ethnicity, one of the things I did with Black Mesa Indigenous Solidarity, which is a group people can still look on, people can still go and support the elders' resistance to stay on their ancestral homeland, if you want to look it up. But one of the things we did is we also worked with Dene youth. And we lived in a community house in Flagstaff, and it was pretty much a queer community house. I think I was the only no, there was one other cis male there, but we were both queer. I don't think there were any straight people there. And, one of the elders was a substitute teacher, one of the elders from Black Mesa, who was the son of Roberta Blackgoat, problematic, but sort of like the MLK of the Navajo Nation. And he put us in touch with some of his youth in a Dene class that he was teaching. And, they kind of had some tells of potentially being queer youth. And so one of the things too that we did with youth that I found really useful is one, we weren't like the youth leader, that like led them. We weren't trying to be big and like friends with them, even though we were. But what we did is we just tried to fundraise so that they could go up to the land and live the culture that they've been taught about forever. And so just bringing them up to have relationship with the land, to have relationship with these elders. And by the way, these elders are like badass. They're like 92-year-old grandmas with shotguns shooting at the feds when they come on their land. Like they are not fucking around. Like you can learn wisdom from most grandmas, unless they're like white supremacists. Maybe we don't need that. But these grandmas were extra special. And so, specifically if we're talking about youth of color, I think connecting youth of color to their ethnic backgrounds, their history, helps them kind of find who they are. Because our culture, I think a lot of people are like, oh, we're the melting pot. And that's actually like, we don't want to be the melting pot. We want to be like a pot where everything's actually very distinct because all cultures are beautiful and we want a diverse, beautiful culture, unlike this current president wants. But I found that to be really successful for the youth to see.
You've been working directly with people experiencing homelessness and housing instability for 2 decades. Today, you are the Food and Social Justice Director at Trinity Church in Asbury Park. Over your 20 years in this space, how have you seen the crisis of housing and hunger evolve? And what are the unique challenges facing families in Monmouth County right now?
Ooh. Well, unfortunately, I've seen the housing crisis sort of fluctuate, but for the last 20 years, it's kind of stayed between like 5 and 700,000. But, after COVID and during the Trump administration, I think we're now hit 1 million people experiencing homelessness. And, I always try not to get on the anti-capitalist train because I sometimes feel it alienates people. But I think connecting housing to a market that's main intention is to profit. And sometimes profiting means not building affordable housing because there's not profit economically. There's great human profit, great community profit, great human rights profit. But unfortunately, when we have an economic system that is built on profit and making more and more and more, I know there was an example. I'm not going to name the corporation because I don't want to get sued and I forget, but they were in Queens, two good things coming together. But they were in Queens and they just did something good for the community and their investors sued them and they won because in our current economic system is to continually profit on a finite planet, which, I think is literally the definition of insanity. So, as long as housing is tied to the market, we're going to see it fluctuate with the market. So, after COVID, it's a disaster because people are hurting. So I think, we need to look at other models of housing and see that housing is a human right. And quite frankly, if you do it in a socialist, anarchist, or capitalist way, it's just something that's got to be done. But at the moment, things are really hard, specific here in Monmouth County. Everything is going up, specifically in Asbury Park. After COVID, a lot of people from New York here and made prices go way up, so there's gentrification and things like this. But I think one thing I really do want to say to folks that are working with people experiencing homelessness, like, yes, have community meals, have soup kitchens, but don't stop there. When you have these relationships, you got to start organizing. Otherwise, our friends are going to experience the same thing. So, in Asbury Park, it was really great with the Asbury Park Affordable Housing Coalition. Two folks who are currently experiencing homelessness with myself and a few others started that organization. And we won 8 inclusionary zoning ordinances in Asbury Park, which means pretty much everywhere there was room for more density and buildings that if there's 5 or more units, there needs to be 20% affordable housing. And then a year after that, we won rent control for the first time in our city's 150-year history. So, while we're volunteering in soup kitchens, while we're talking to folks on the street, because if you don't have the time to work with folks experiencing homelessness, the very least we can do is when you're walking by someone, talk to them, see them, maybe give them money. It's kind of up to you. Maybe get them a sandwich. But you cannot look through people, like going back to what you were saying, we have that inherent in the Christian world. It's we all have the image of God. We all have humanity. We're all worth it. So from that very little thing, we must do that. But we also need to start organizing. If the government's not doing it, we need to do it. So while we're pushing the government here in Monmouth County, we're pushing the state, we're pushing the county, we're pushing our municipalities. We're also started a new initiative with the Monmouth Housing Coalition, where we're talking to every religious institution in Monmouth County and seeing if they're willing to build affordable. And really, no matter where you are, Mercer County or anywhere, churches are able to build affordable on their properties. So yeah, it's really daunting. It's really hard. There's not a lot of housing. Building housing is slow. So the next few years are going to be rough, even if we are able to build housing. But we really need to do everything we get. And again, it's that inherent connectedness. And I think if there's a way that you can get involved in that level of humanism, that's what this world needs because we are always we're educated through that public school system to be individualistic. And I always ask like when is it taught that it's not cool to share? Because you go into kindergarten even in our public school systems. And like can you imagine like let's just say there's somewhat of a diverse class and like two white kids get there early and like take all the toys and all the teachers are like, "Well, oh well." No, the teachers are like, no, like Billy and Bobby, you got to share. And then at some point, like it's not cool to share. We become part of this very individualistic culture. And once I was living in Bolivia, and this Amara woman said, in America, 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 is 4. In Bolivia, 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 is 1. So they came from a culture where whenever they're making big decisions, they're thinking about the whole. They're not thinking about their money or their family's health. They're thinking about the entire nation, the entire tribe. If we're going to talk about people experiencing homelessness and the housing crisis, we need to create a cultural movement where when we're making decisions, we're thinking of other people than us, than our bio fams and things like that.
So, when I introduced you and you sent me your bio, you talked about the ways you find joy, grounding in liberation and earth theologies, reading, writing, surfing, walking in wild places. The work you do it's heavy, and burnout among advocates and parents is so real. I'm curious, how do your spiritual and natural practices sustain you? And how can we model sustainable joy in the struggle for our children so they don't inherit just our fatigue, but our hope?
I think the first answer is a sad one, is a dark one. I think we have to learn to be okay with sadness and mourning, that that's a part of life. So it doesn't cripple us when it happens. I mean, I will say the Dene people have the darkest sense of humor. Like some of these jokes, I'm like, am I allowed to laugh at that as a white person? Like I don't know if that's acceptable. But they counter it with joy and humor because sometimes specifically when we talk about genocide, which my people, the German people have committed genocide. I've never been part of a genocide. I've seen a community experience genocide, and I got secondary trauma just from being connected to them. So it's taken me a very long time to find balance. One of my favorite theologians is this French man called Jacques Ellul, and he wrote a little primary on Christian anarchy, just making the connections. His spirituality is a lot about tension, so like pulling from Asian culture as well, different various Asian cultures. And I've really tried to embrace that to find true joy, you also have to mourn. You also have to walk with those who are mourning, with those who are oppressed, because that means you're living the real life. So the answer to that question is like you're going to be a little fucked up until we live in a healthier society. Because our job as activists is to make it easier for people to make good and healthy choices. So the first answer to that question is like, yeah, like embrace the darkness, be real, and walk with people and mourn with people. I think our culture constantly is about never being bored, joy, joy, joy. Let's go, consume, consume, consume. So first slow down and gear in that and support community. And then that second part is there's a theologian, Henry Nouwen, I forget, but basically talks about joy needs to be a practice, that you need to actually practice joy. So in the midst of the darkness of, the new bill that just passed legislation making gender affirming care very difficult in this country, sit with each other, mourn with each other, cry with each other. But I take what's called somatic therapy, and you can change the patterns in your brain. And it's not helpful to mourn and wallow all day long. So you have to choose to get out of that, place it in a compartment. And then, you know what? I've thought about that today. I've done the work for that today. I'm going to choose joy for the rest of the day. And at first, it doesn't really work. You're spinning in your head, thinking about like Kurds dying in northern Syria or something. But then eventually, the more you practice, nope, it's time to practice joy. Whether you play soccer, you read, you walk, you swim, you talk to friends, you do harm reduction. The more you practice, the more easily you're going to be able to choose joy because you're creating a pattern in your head. So, as a former user of opiates, 25 years sober, just like I created that pattern to get used to that, you can create patterns of joy that the more you practice it, just like any sport, any job, the more you practice, you're going to get better. But joy is a practice and you need to practice it. And the more you practice it, the more it's accessible. But I don't think, we can get sometimes like Eastern spirituality is practiced by white folks. I'm a little concerned sometimes because it seems to be a lot about joy and peace, but not about struggle and mourning and sadness with those who do that. So I really believe in the importance of it and intention. If we ever live in an unsettler society, maybe that can change. But at this current moment, I think that that is the way to have the healthiest real relationship with our siblings and with the earth and creator.
Lisa, you get the last question.
Derek, we always like to close with a takeaway that stays with our audience. Our listeners are parents, caretakers, and advocates trying to raise conscientious, empathetic kids. What is one piece of advice or an invitation you want to leave with parents who want to raise their children to be active participants in the fight for social and environmental justice?
I would say kids learn from what you do. So make sure that you're walking the talk, first of all. My kiddo likes to tell me specifically that my kiddo is not an anarchist. But clearly, also from, my kiddo's mom, also an activist in the community, has really understood what it's like to love people and the importance of loving people and fighting against oppression, even though has already decided not to do it in the same way. So, your kids are watching you. Make sure you're walking the talk. And then second, let your kid be who they want to be. And it can be so hard. I remember reading zines like, what happens if your kid becomes a capitalist? And you know what they said? They're like, you still got to love them. You still got to love them. And love your kids where they're at. And like, if there are any, I mean, probably not listening to this podcast that I'm talking on, but if there are any more conservative parents out there, loving your kid is giving your kid freedom to be who they are. And I wished for 10 years I kept that secret that I wasn't straight, that I loved other people, that I was more complex. And that was in my developing age. Who knows what my sexuality would have been like if I was free to be honest with my parents, my caregivers. I mean, I had a real fucked up time trying to heal and just accept me for who I am. We have to trust our kids, trust our kids as much as you can that you feel like it's not going to be harmful, but trust them and listen to them. I think, when we talk about hierarchy, boundaries between creating boundaries and power dynamics, I'm not quite sure how to do it as a parent. And each kid is different. So when we're giving advice about kids, it's like it doesn't fit all kids, but be aware of that power dynamic where we can learn from our kids as well. My dad, love him. He died about 15 years ago, but he always had to be right. He always had to be right. And I hated it. And you know what? I always had to be right. I learned that even though I hated it. And I lose it. Like as parents, you're going to lose it. I've been a horrible parent. I've yelled. I've lost my shit. But what makes it a little bit different, as soon as possible, the 11th step, repent, apologize, talk about how that's not the way to respond. That's not how I want to be, that we can change. We can change these dynamics. And I talked to my kiddo about, hey, you know what? If I taught you that, I'm sorry. Like, let's unlearn it together. And so, yeah, just love your kids. And loving someone means giving them freedom.
Miss Makoviak would be really proud of our conversation today. So thank you for invoking her spirit with us.
Mm.
And just thank you for joining us at such short notice. It's really been a pleasure to have you here and to have this deeper conversation around parenting and justice and the importance of reciprocity, not in us expecting to receive, but when people give of themselves to us understanding that breaking that colonial construct is to then reciprocate with care and love. And so thank you for doing that.
Thanks, Derek.
Well,
Love you, man.
I love you too, but also mad thanks to you for just having this podcast to create this conversation. And Stephen, yeah, it's just such an honor to have you as a sibling. And just your voice in this movement is so powerful. And like, I love some intersectionality. And sometimes in the LGBTQ community, we're not talking about other issues as much. And, the LGBTQIA plus community has, including leaving trans folks off the bill, we have a history in that. So I really appreciate you. And I super notice that you're always making the connections. So I appreciate that. And also meeting you really for the first time. It was so sweet. Your spirit was so good. Your wisdom, your questions, your joy. I really enjoyed getting to know you through this podcast as well. So I really appreciate you both and look forward to building a relationship with you.
Now it's time for our recurring segment, Allies and Assholes, where we highlight individuals and groups who are supporting the LGBTQI community on the one hand and call out straight up assholes who are trying to move us all backwards on the other. Lisette, who are we talking about today?
Stephen, someone we both love, our ally of the week goes to New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani. The Mamdani administration announced a $15 million investment aimed at protecting access to gender-affirming care. According to the statement given to them, the funding will support three primary initiatives: a direct access care fund, a dedicated resource call and text line for trans New Yorkers, and expanded funding for the LGBTQIA healthcare research.
That's amazing in a time where almost everything that you read about in the news involving trans people is overwhelmingly negative. Thank you, New York Times. It's so wonderful to have someone who gets it, someone who speaks up, and then someone who puts their money where their mouth is. New York City has a mayor who is not only talking the talk, but walking the walk, which is so critical at a time where, as we were talking about at the top of the hour, healthcare institutions are pulling back care even when they don't have to. So to have the city of New York actually allocate funding to ensure access to care for trans and gender expansive people, I think it's really awesome.
And we should note that many people in New York did critique Mamdani because the provision stated that no one under the age of 19 could access this programming care. And so there's still a lot of work to do, but kudos to Mamdani for getting the ball rolling.
Yes, something is better than nothing. And so we can critique something and still uphold it as a way forward. Two things can be true at once.
Absolutely. And this is why this week's Ally of the Week goes to New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani.
Congratulations to Mayor Mamdani. Now on to our asshole of the week. Our asshole of the week goes to the British royal family. The royal family is facing backlash after sharing a photo of Queen Camilla. I don't even like saying those words. Hosting Harry Potter author She Who Shall Not Be Named on the final day of Pride. The public backlash focused tightly on the framing of the announcement and its timing. Critics also noted that the royal family passed over countless current children's authors to celebrate someone whose last major youth release was literally decades ago, with several observers highlighting the fact that making this specific gesture during Pride Month felt like a deliberate choice.
Voldemort seemed to be really happy cuddled up next to the royal queen, as we know her
The
now.
royal adulteress, come
And,
queen.
when you think about what's happening in the UK right now, the access to public spaces, the fact that people are waiting, that they are on healthcare waiting lists for more than 90 years before they can access care, that photo is a representation of so much more work that needs to be done in the UK, and the ways in which both the US and the UK are leading the pack in hateful anti-trans policies and culture and all the words that I can't think of right now that would fit it perfectly.
And because they saddled up to Baltimore on the last day of Pride, this is why the British royal family is our asshole of the week. Well, that's our show for today, folks. I'd like to thank our guest, Derek Bloom, for joining us today. And I got to give it up to my incredible co-host across the pond, Lisette Trujillo, for helping hold space in these really vulnerable times.
And Stephen, I've missed you, and I have to admit, because you let me see the dads once, I let my dad watch the dads too. Sorry, Lucina. But my dad watched it with my sister. And I always I'll admit, I have a hard time watching it because it feels out of body. But my family was really moved. And we miss you guys so much. And just keep doing the good work. And I'm so glad I got to spend time with you on this new episode. And thank you to all of our listeners who've been patient waiting for new episodes to drop. We couldn't do this without all of you.
And folks, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, Substacks, and YouTube channel. Follow us on Instagram and my TikTok, and do everything you got to do to stay up to date with everything going on here at the Parent Advocate Podcast.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.